Higgs bosons. Higgs won the Nobel Prize. Peter Higgs is an atheist. A few years before that, Bill Phillips won the same Nobel Prize for physics. He's a Christian. Now, it ought to be completely obvious, but it isn't to many people, that if two people win the same Nobel Prize, they are not divided by their science. Faith in God is compatible with the Nobel Prize for physics. Faith in atheism is compatible with the Nobel Prize in physics. You see, it's interesting. We put faith on the religious side, but actually, atheism is a faith. Because my atheist friends, of whom I have many, believe in the philosophy of naturalism or even materialism. So we're talking about what they believe. Stephen Hawking says that we must now, in the 21st century, choose between science and God, because science has made God irrelevant. But what's his reason for that choice? Because Newton didn't have to choose. The more you understand of engineering, the more you admire the genius of a Rolls or a Royce in their engineering design. The more you understand of architecture, the more you might admire the library over there. And so the more that science reveals about the nature and operation of the universe, the more I could admire that God did it that way. Why? Because God is not the same kind of explanation as science is. Now, this is the heart of the argument. This is the scientific confusion that Dawkins repeats again and again. He makes the mistake, which is a very simple mistake, that God's the same kind of explanation as science. Now let's look at this. Science explains. That's at the heart of our whole debate. Science has made God irrelevant. Why? Because science explains. We need to be careful with that. What does it mean to say that science explains? Well, let's take the law of gravity, since we've been talking about it. What does the law of gravity explain? Well, when I was at school, some parts of physics weren't very well taught. And I was taught that the law of gravity explains gravity. It doesn't, of course. Nobody knows what gravity is. And if you don't agree with me, I'm actually quoting Richard Feynman, who won the Nobel Prize for physics. The law of gravity enables us to make very good predictions. We can land someone on the moon without Einstein's corrections, but it doesn't tell you what gravity is. Now, this is very interesting. When we say science explains because it's given us a law, that doesn't mean that even within the competence of science we have a complete explanation. That's point number one. Now comes point number two. There are different levels of explanation. Why is the kettle boiling? Well, it's boiling because the heat energy from the flame is being conducted through the copper of the kettle and is reaching the molecules of the water and is agitating them, and they're moving faster and faster and faster. That's why it's boiling. Nonsense. It's boiling because I desperately need a cup of tea. Now, your laughter tells us something, because my use of the word nonsense is ridiculous. You see immediately that the explanation, the scientific one, doesn't conflict with a personal one. I want a cup of tea. And what is more, the scientific one is less important than the personal one. I mean, people have been having tea for thousands of years, not understanding the science behind it. Now, here's a very important thing. This illustrates at a simple level the fact that you can have different kinds of explanation, one in terms of law and mechanism, science, the other in terms of personal agency, without there being any tension or conflict. Now, let me state it this way. God no more competes with science when it comes to explaining the universe than Henry Ford competes with the law of internal combustion in explaining the existence of a motor car engine. Have you got that? They're different kinds of explanation. So how have we got the idea that science has made God irrelevant, because the cultural authority of science, which has produced all the iPhones you're twittering on and all this kind of stuff instead of listening to me, because science has been so successful, there has arisen the notion that science is the only way to truth. We call that scientism. Bertrand Russell once said, "What science cannot tell us, mankind cannot know." Now, he was quite a brilliant philosopher and mathematician, but his logic departed him when he made that statement. The statement, "What science cannot tell us, mankind cannot know," is not a statement of science. So if it's true, it's false. You cannot know it. It's logically incoherent. And we need to listen to people like Sir Peter Medawar, also a Nobel Prize winner, who said it's so easy to see that science has limits. It cannot even answer the questions of a child. Who am I? Where do I come from? Where am I going? What is the meaning of my life? I'm passionate about science, but not to realize that scientific explanation at several different levels doesn't give us the whole story. It doesn't even give us the most important story in many cases. And certainly to say that science has made God irrelevant is to misunderstand A, the nature of science, and B, the nature of God. Certainly the Higgs boson makes God irrelevant if you're giving a lecture in quantum physics. I do not talk about God when I'm teaching mathematics in the University of Oxford. But the Higgs boson is more relevant than God for quantum physics. But if the question is, why is it that there exists a universe in which quantum physics can be done, then God is much more relevant than the Higgs boson. It depends on which question you're asking. The tragedy, to my mind, is that simplistic arguments like that stop so many students in the 21st century even thinking about the God question. You see, we live in a minute fraction of space-time, and for centuries people have been thinking about this. And the period of the ascendancy of atheism, how long it will last, I just don't know. But we need to revisit some of these arguments because of their extreme weakness in my estimation. Now, here's a fascinating thing. The Bible has said for centuries that space-time had a beginning. In the beginning, God created. But science, natural science, didn't believe it until, really believe it, until the 1960s, which I remember very well. And when the evidence started coming in for a hot Big Bang beginning to the universe, it was resisted by our leading scientists. Why? Because, as the editor of Nature then wrote, it gives too much leverage to people who believe in the Bible. Here was the greatest astrophysical advance in the 20th century being resisted because it converged with something the Bible had been saying for centuries. But now comes the problem. If there was a beginning and there was nothing before it, how do you get, Leibniz's question, how do you get something from nothing? Now this is interesting. Why? Because you see, Stephen Hawking in Cambridge holds or held the same chair as Isaac Newton. And Stephen Hawking studies gravitation. He studies black holes. And Stephen Hawking has come to the conclusion that the law of gravitation implies that there's no God. So Newton uses it for an argument that there is a God. Hawking uses it for an argument that there isn't a God. Now that interests me. Hawking's argument, to quote him verbatim, in his book The Grand Design with Leonard Mlodinow, is, because there is a law of gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. And that's his argument for finding God irrelevant. And I ought to say why I find Hawking's explanation not very satisfactory. Newton, a law of gravitation illustrates the glory of God. Hawking, a law of gravitation proves there isn't a God. Why? I repeat now. Because there is a law of gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. What? When I first read that, I thought, logically, this is fascinating. I love logic. Because there is a law of gravity, that is because there is something, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. Because there's something, it creates itself from nothing. Contradiction number one. That's a flat contradiction. Number two, because there is a law of gravity, not because there is gravity. What would a law of gravity mean if there's no such thing as gravity? And you will find physicists, like Hawking, but much more like Paul Davies, who suggest that laws can create the universe. Wow. And the interesting fascination to me about it is, at the beginning of his book, Hawkins gives an example of law. And the law is the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. But surely it's obvious to him, as everybody else, that that law doesn't create the sun, or the east, or the west. It describes a setup that's already there. So that's point number two. Point number three, the universe will create itself from nothing. Well, if I say X creates Y, what does that mean? Well, roughly, if you've got X, you're likely to get Y. If I say X creates X, what does that mean? Well, if you've got X, you'll get X. And what does that mean? Well, it means, frankly, that nonsense remains nonsense, even if scientists write it. It's just nonsense. And then, the coup de grace, which I haven't time to explain, is a universe from nothing. What do you mean by nothing? And I find it very, amusing, really. The attempts to get something for nothing. My position as a Christian is, the universe came from nothing physical. It didn't come from nothing. God created it. But in the natural sciences, the atheists have got to say it came from nothing. How? Well, the way they now deal with it, as I understand it, is to redefine nothing. And nothing becomes a quantum vacuum, which is something, alive or potential. And you get statements like this. What would you think of a statement like this if you were asked to parse it logically? Statement is, because something is physical, nothing must be physical, especially if you define it as the absence of something. What? That was written by a leading astrophysicist, desperate to make something out of nothing. Much ado about nothing. And they haven't solved the problem, ladies and gentlemen. It's getting worse. Alan Guth, the father of the theory of inflation, we had a very friendly discussion in front of many scientists, and I said, Alan, I must ask you a question. When you as an astrophysicist use the word nothing, you're not using it in the normal, everyday, philosophical sense of absence of anything. He said, of course we're not. And I thanked him very much. They haven't got a universe from nothing, in spite of the number of books that claim that that has been done. I once had a debate with Peter Atkins, and we were chatting. I said, Peter, he's a professor of physical chemistry. I'm sure you have dozens of his books here in the library. What created the universe? And he said, mathematics. And I just couldn't help myself. And he said, what are you laughing at? Well, I said, Peter, frankly, I am a mathematician, and that must be the silliest thing I've ever heard. He said, why? Well, I said, look, let's keep it simple. 1 + 1 = 2. Did that ever put £2 in your pocket? I was at dinner in college, and I was sitting beside a biochemist. Listen, he said, I'm an atheist, I'm a reductionist, that's it, and we're going to have an awful evening. So I said, no, we're not, actually. I'm interested in reductionism. And I said, why don't we do an experiment? So he had a look at the menu. On the menu it said, R-O-A-S-T, chicken. So he read it for me. He said, that's roast chicken. I said, is it? How do you know? Well, he said, it says it. I said, well, they're just marks on paper. Yes, but they mean roast chicken. Oh, I said, these marks carry meaning. You're a reductionist. Yes, he said. Everything in terms of physics and chemistry? Yes, he said. Okay, I said, explain to me the semiotics of those marks, the way they carry meaning, in terms of the physics and chemistry of the paper and ink. And he didn't try. He said something quite remarkable. He said, you know, he led the biggest biology research unit in Oxford, and he said, for 40 years I've come into my laboratory thinking that could be done. And he said, I see it can't. I was so shocked. I played devil's advocate, and I said, look, chemistry and physics have only been going for 500 years. He said, it doesn't matter. You cannot completely explain that because it carries meaning without introducing a mind. But he studied DNA. Roast is 5 letters long, yes? How long is the human genome? 3.5 billion letters in a chemical alphabet in exactly the right order, carrying meaning. They're semiotic, codes for the proteins. And you can see what I said to him next, can't you? How do you deal with the human genome? Oh, he said, hasard et nécessité, chance and necessity. I said, really? Why don't you say chance and necessity for a 5-letter word, and you say it for a 3.5 billion letter word? This is the worldview playing a role, you see. It's nothing to do with science. If you're looking at the facts, what the facts reveal is we've got the longest word we've ever discovered in each of the 10 trillion cells in our bodies. They demand interpretation. Now, if you are an atheist, you have to explain them reductionistically. You see, I have more options because I'm not an atheist, and because I want to follow the logical implications of the existence of language. And I close with this remark. There are basically 2 big worldviews clashing here. One says, in the beginning was mass energy or nothing. And everything has developed from nothing, mass energy, by the laws of nature, wherever they came from. And that's a huge extra question. And they've developed up into planets, stars, life, consciousness, mind, and the idea of God, because there isn't a God. The other worldview goes like this. In the beginning was the Word. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All things came to be through him. And without him, nothing came to be that came to be. Has science made God irrelevant? Absolutely not. It is the God hypothesis that makes sense of the greatest scientific discovery of the 20th century. That we are word-based. Biologically, we're word and text producers as persons, and all of that, added to the mathematical describability of the universe, points towards an intelligent God behind the universe who is the Word. That's only the start of explanation. But it goes further, of course. I'm not only a scientist who believes in God, I'm a Christian. And the next big step is to realize that there's evidence that the Word has become human in Jesus Christ. But that's a story for another time. Thank you very much.